All right, everybody, thank you for coming out. Welcome to DC 813 and welcome to our class on Introduction to Vulnerability Scanning. My name is Crisis Zana, also known as Sparkles. A little bit about me. I'm currently working as a penetration tester. I've previously worked for a number of years as a security analyst doing defensive security. I've worked priorly with the government and the private sector. I've got the alphabet soup there, everything except the OSCP, which I'm working on. And I don't have CEH anymore because I let them expire. We're just going to talk a little bit. We've had our introduction. We're going to talk about an introduction to vulnerability scanning. We're going to have a break if you guys want to. And then we'll have our hands-on labs. So, what is vulnerability scanning? Vulnerability scanning is the use of automated tools to scan systems or applications for known vulnerabilities. Okay, oh, and feel free at any time to interrupt, to ask questions, just comment, tell a story, anything you want. There are four main types of vulnerability scanning that we do. There's network vulnerability scanners, application vulnerability scanners, source code analysis tools, and mobile device vulnerability scanners. In this class, we primarily will be talking about the first two. The other two are kind of outside the scope of this class. We're going to go over some definitions. Vulnerability. Vulnerability is a weakness within a system that can be exploited by an adversary to obtain access to a system. An exploit is something that takes advantage of said vulnerability to provide access. Here are some examples that we have. The vulnerability would be a human employee. Your exploit is social engineering. Your vulnerability, weak locks. As we had our lockpicking class not too long ago, we know that the locks are built with defects that cause us to be able to exploit them through lockpicking and bypass. Some more examples. Backdoored software with hardwired passwords. We've seen numerous examples of this. I believe Cisco's had some issues with this, if I'm not mistaken. The exploit is simple, using the password to access the systems, because oftentimes those things aren't disclosed for years until some researcher finds out about it. Then we can go in there, use those passwords to access the systems. Misconfigurations allowing information disclosure. An example of that would be a DNS zone transfer. Okay? When DNS was designed, nobody thought that users would be pretending to be DNS servers and actually requesting that information that they weren't supposed to be able to get. And finally, we have poor programming practices. Exploit example would be a buffer overflow, allows you to get remote code execution, and from there, you go on and on the system. Why do we do vulnerability scanning? Well, someone else is scanning your network. You should probably know what they're seeing. I mean, in the example of this that I have is years ago I was working for an organization, and organization got compromised. Well, it was a fairly simple thing that allowed them access to the organization, but nobody was doing that external vulnerability scanning to discover this type of hidden activity out there and find out that this was on the network. We also do this for compliance reasons. A lot of organizations that are out there are going to be required to do things such as vulnerability scanning, such as penetration testing, for compliance. One of the standards would be the PCI standard. And you can read here, I'm not a compliance guy, I'm a technical guy, and I do that deliberately. But yeah, this is one of the standards that they have out there, and it does require at least internal and external vulnerability scanning. Let's see here, at least quarterly and after any significant change in the network, which I think is a really good idea. Because oftentimes, we just do things on a set schedule. But we forget that, hey, maybe your domain admin left the network. Maybe we should do a vulnerability scan just to see that nothing was left behind, that, any surprises weren't left behind. Or, if you do a significant change in the network, a major upgrade, a major renovation, maybe you want to do those things again just to double check. Vulnerability scanning versus pen testing. Some organizations historically across our industry have confused these two. And it's a pretty common thing. You'll see it in talks all across the internet if you do some searching about organizations who are claim they're looking for a pen test, and all they want is a vulnerability scan. Now, we can debate back and forth whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is what it is, and vice versa. Vulnerability scanning, as we said before, is scanning for and reporting those known vulnerabilities that are reported by an application or a tool. Penetration testing involves finding those vulnerabilities in the systems and then exploiting them to gain access and assess the organizational risk. And that last point is important. The reason that we do penetration testing is to actually determine the risk to the organization. What can these vulnerabilities allow somebody to do? How can it affect our business? How is scanning done in corporations? In my experience, there are several different options, okay? Sometimes you have internal penetration testers who are authorized to do vulnerability scanning on their own. However, oftentimes, there's also another team that explicitly does vulnerability scanning. Of course, they can have different names, but they are usually assigned to that role, and that's what they do. And then the penetration testing team may be able to contact them and say, hey, we're doing a pen test on this business unit. We need their vulnerability results for the last quarter, or whatever the case may be. So they contact them, send those results over, and then they use those in addition to their penetration testing and their information gathering. Network vulnerability scanners. Network scanners are used to scan network systems and devices for known vulnerabilities. And an important point there is known vulnerabilities. These things are not going to detect unknown vulnerabilities that nobody knew existed. They're not going to detect 0 days, okay? They primarily work on a database of known vulnerable software, as well as sending traffic to systems to test for specific vulnerabilities. This helps us identify, and according to new special publication 800, vulnerability scanning can help identify outdated software versions, missing patches, misconfigurations, and validate compliance with your organization's security policy. Your organization should have a security policy that tells employees what they can and can't do, how often your system should be patched, and so on and so forth. Sorry, I was just thinking about something else that I wanted to add here, but I can't remember exactly what it was. But anyway, I'll figure it out. Web application vulnerability scanners. These are the other major class of scanners that we have out there. They're used to scan applications, web applications, for vulnerabilities. They traditionally expect requests and responses to the applications, looking for misconfigurations, and sending traffic to the web server to determine how it responds, to determine if a vulnerability exists. We'll look at these a little bit later. Sorry about how the words get cut off a little bit. For some reason, the software that I'm using shows weird, but when I do it in Microsoft, it's even weirder. So, yeah. OpenBox, Nessus, and Expose Community Edition, Retina, Metasploit modules are the main ones that I've seen used in professional penetration testing. And of course, these slides will be available to anyone who wants them afterwards, as well as all of our classes. If you need either the videos, our videos are posted on YouTube, and we do have the slide decks available for anyone who wants them. Wildcards would be MBSA, Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, and the InMap scripting engine. And we're going to cover some of these. The non-free ones, Core Impact. And I have a star there because this is not technically just a vulnerability scanner, it is a penetration testing tool. However, organizations can use it in different ways. You can use just the vulnerability scanning capabilities if you want, and I've heard of organizations doing that. Several of the free products that I mentioned before do have professional versions. As an example, Nessus Community Edition, Expose Community Edition, Retina, they all have professional versions that you can use. And of course, the professional version of Metasploit would be, can you think of the name? I know it's Rapid7 is the company, but.
Metasploit Pro.
Metasploit Pro, thank you. I don't use it. Some popular web application scanners that we have out there are Nikto, Burp Suite, and Zeta Protect Proxy. Now, of course, these two right here are actually proxies versus scanners. However, they do have scanners within them that are used for the web application scanning. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Okay, first one we're going to cover is OpenBox. OpenBox is a free open source network vulnerability scanner. It has detection modules that are written in the Nessus I want to say Nessus attack scripting language. Could be a little bit wrong on that one. But in NASL, allowing for extendability that allows you to write different signatures for the latest attacks. So let's say that there's a vulnerability that's announced today, and you have some IOCs, or excuse me, you have some information on how to detect this, and your vendor hasn't released the new signatures yet. Well, you can, if you know NASL, you can actually write those modules, install them into your system, and get and scan your network for these vulnerabilities. Latest version that I tested had issues that had to be resolved before the product would work, and I think it was 3 months ago I tested. I had OpenBox running, working fine. It was supposed to be in there as a exercise, and then a couple months later I came back, started over again, and it broke. So we didn't include it in here as a lab. However, it is something that's free open source. It's also easily accessible in Calais. You can easily install it, and if it's working at that time, it should be fine for you. I will say that in my experience, a lot of professional organizations aren't using it, but there's nothing wrong with learning how to use it within your environment, within your lab at home, to get some experience with it. Nessus. Nessus is a full-featured network vulnerability scanner that allows for scanning and reporting of vulnerabilities. It can even scan for some known malware, allowing admins to search their network for compromised hosts. A couple of the tools that we will be talking about do have some level of functionality for this. I will say that in my experience, it's not very comprehensive. It's usually going to go for the big ones that are, the money drivers. And you'll see that a little bit later. Actually, right now. So this is just a screenshot of the Nessus interface. As you can see here, you've got bad lock detection that detects for this vulnerability. Shell shock detection, that's a major vulnerability that came out a couple years ago, as well as drown. And you also have here the malware scan that you can use to search your network for several different types of malware that it detects. You also have WannaCry ransomware, which is one of the things that was big, I'd say last year, maybe the last 2 years. I personally think that should be included in the malware scan, but that's a different story. And as you can see here with the Pro version, you would get some additional functionality to include the mobile device scan. In my experience, I think there's a real weakness in that home users don't have tools to check their mobile devices for malicious software. Of course, you have your antivirus that you can install on your phone, but I still would like to see some open source scanners for mobile devices. I haven't seen any open source ones as of yet, but I'm not an expert. Could be out there, I just haven't heard about it. A note here about credentialed versus uncredentialed scanning. Uncredentialed scans are ones that do not include the credentials for the system that you're testing. They generally are going to be less likely to find the vulnerabilities versus the credentialed ones. The credentialed ones actually authenticate to the system. They can interrogate the system for missing patch levels or specific software that it's running. It's like, hey, not only are you running a vulnerable version of Windows, but you're also running some software, some third-party software that's out of date that needs to be updated as well. The credential scans tend to be able to detect those kinds of issues, whereas your uncredentialed ones won't. As you can see here, this is a scan that I did uncredentialed on one of my systems. It found 21 vulnerabilities, but only 2 of them were significant. The credentialed scan, it found 25 vulnerabilities and a lot more significant vulnerabilities. So, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, generally you want to try and do credential scans when you can. Of course, there's a lot of things to consider with that, especially when you're talking about enterprise networks. One thing I would want to think about as an issue would be, do you want to create accounts on those boxes? Do you want to have a service account? What level of access should that service account actually have? So on and so forth.
In what situation would you do an uncredentialed scan?
That's a good question. I suppose if you were just looking for a quick, a quick scan just to say, hey, what's going on? What can I see really quick? that might be something you would think about. Or if you're doing an external test and you don't have official access to the system at that point, you may want to see what's publicly accessible from an attacker's perspective who doesn't have any additional credentialed access to the system. That would be an example of a time I would use a uncredentialed scan. And then once I gain credentialed access to the system, you could redo their scan as credentialed. Metasploit modules as vulnerability scanners. As we noted earlier, Metasploit does have modules that allow you to scan for vulnerabilities. And again, these are free and open source. They're available on Kali Linux. Some of the examples are right here. This first one is one that scans for a backdoor. The second one checks for the IPMI version of a specific software. I think it's HP. And there's a specific vulnerability associated with that which you can research. These are very useful. I use these a lot of times on network penetration tests. After you do your InMap scans, after you've looked at everything that you can, you may want to look specifically for things like this. Maybe you want to do, not a WannaCry, a scan for MS1710, whatever the case may be. So you just scan your network range to see if any of those Windows hosts that are on your network are vulnerable to it. Web application scanners. These generally require specialized scanners. Now technically, again, as you might have seen in the Nessus screenshot, they may include a web application scanning component, or they may just say, hey, you can scan web service with it. But you're going to get the best bang for your buck by having a separate scanner for your web applications. Some Vuln scanners, that's exactly what I said there. Nikto. Nikto is a really good web application scanner that's built into Kali. It's good at finding missing headers, default pages, some other things. However, if you're using this for real work, you want to make sure you change the user agent if you're not doing this. As an internal tester, I'm not really concerned about it, because if I'm testing an internal application, unfortunately, most of the times there's not going to be any detection capability between me and the target that's going to detect this and cause any issues. However, let's say you were doing an external test. You're coming from the outside to test a public web server that your organization owns or that you have authorization to test, and you don't necessarily want to let the defenders know that you're testing this application at this point. Well, you may want to change that user agent string, because it's going to scream right out, say, hey, I'm Nikto, and any IDS work that's saw is going to have a signature for that, and send an alert to the blue team. And then they may block you or whatever the case may be. Now, if it's your intention to test their responses, you might want to do that. But most of the time, that's not my job. And this isn't going to be a real demo, it's just going to be an example, but I've included some commands here so you can see them. What I'm doing here is I'm opening up TCP Dump, which is a program that allows you to capture your packets, your network packets, putting it into a file, and then I'm going to run nikto-h, and then the IP or URL of the target. And as an example here, you can just see some of the traffic that it's sending. You can see it's looking for these specific web pages, these specific files. You can also see that it's sending specific specific attack strings, such as, hey, I want to do cross-site scripting, or possibly SQL injection. It's going to try those attack things. Now, one thing to look at is this is unencrypted, so it can be seen across the network. So that is something to consider. However, it really depends on your tests and what your focus is. But another good thing is you can see this when someone's doing this against your network. Blah, blah, blah. And again, you can see the data down here in the window. And if I was on a different piece of traffic, you'd actually see the user agent down there as well. Burp. Burp is a full-featured web application assessment tool which includes scanning functionality. Now, again, we're not going to cover this in depth. We have had a couple of classes on web app pen testing. However, if you haven't had the opportunity to take that class, you can go take Sunny's class or buy her book. As a wild card, we have MBSA. MBSA is a Microsoft Baseline Security Analyzer, It's not a traditional vulnerability scanner. It's a compliance tool that Microsoft released several years ago to aid organizations in validating compliance. And it works by validating whether security patches for Windows and Windows products are installed. It can do additional checks. I'm not really an expert with it, but we'll give you an example here. We scanned this system. It said, hey, you're missing 5 security updates. It didn't find any SQL, so it couldn't test the firewall. But then it told us what specific patches we were missing. Now, one thing of interest to note here is that with Microsoft and their recent changes within the past couple of years, it used to be that you could go and you could install security updates directly from Windows Update. However, these days they bundle. They bundle security updates along with quality updates. It's really annoying for individuals like myself because sometimes I just want the security patches. I don't want the other crud that Microsoft's delivering to break something and whatnot. However, you can still download the security-only updates from the Microsoft website. You can't do it from Windows Update. So, when you install those patches, a tool like this may not detect that the patch is installed. And it may tell you, hey, because it's looking for the official Microsoft release of a security and quality update, and they said, hey, you got all these patches missing. Well, no, I don't. I installed the security update, but it has a different KB number, so just be aware that could be an issue that you come around with. Usually you just have to remove those from the report and, well, double check that you've actually installed the correct patch and then remove it from the report. Unfortunately, MBSA is no longer being developed. The latest version is 2.3. It is not updated to support Windows 10 and Windows Server 2016 and beyond. However, it is available from some non-Microsoft sources. Use it at your own risk. However, it's decent software. I mean, if you want to run it on Windows 7 or some of the older operating systems, I wouldn't have an issue with it. But again, non-Microsoft sources, so pick your poison. This was going to be an alternative to MBSA called Secunia PSI. I used it several years ago. Just to double check my system, I would just run it. It would tell me, hey, you're missing some Microsoft patches, some third-party patches. Because all of us have probably tons of software on our computers, and we don't have time to go run to every vendor's website and check to see if their software is updated. This used to do those checks for you. Unfortunately, it's been discontinued as well. So you can visit this link for a list of possible alternatives. I haven't reviewed those, so I can't recommend any of them specifically or tell you their value. NSC. InMap is a well-known vulnerability scanner, or excuse me, a well-known network scanner. Modern versions of InMap have a function called NSC, the InMap scripting engine. It allows you to extend the functionality of InMap beyond just being a port scanner, which is traditionally what we know it as. It includes scripts that can be used to find vulnerable systems that are already infected with malware. And you can go to the InMap website, and they have a full documentation that you can find that explains just about everything that you can do with NSC. There's also a good book that's available, written by the creator of InMap, and it includes everything, including NSC in there. These are just some of the things that the vulnerability scanners that are included within NSC. As you can see here, there's an example, CLAM AV exec, a firewall bypass, a net filter, Pro FTP backdoor. This could be useful in some certain labs that you may be doing. Again, some more vulnerabilities and specific versions of software, Cold Fusion bypass or Cold Fusion exploits and stuff like that. This is just an example of how you would actually run a script scan within InMap. You first do your InMap, -- script, SMB vulnerability MS08026, or MS08067, that's the other famous vulnerability. I try to get away from 08, the other one because it's just so well known. Why not get that one? And then the port, and then the host. And again, the InMap website does have good examples of these. And this is just an example of using this on a live system. Shows you the ports open as is normal for InMap. but then it goes ahead and gives you the script results. Host appears to be vulnerable to the remote code execution, gives you some data on the actual exploit itself, or on the vulnerability itself, and then you can go ahead and exploit it if you were doing a penetration test. Because again, remember, difference between vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. It may not be your job to actually exploit this. It might just be your job to report it. Now, there is something to be said about not reporting false positives, but we'll get into false positives a little bit later. Realistically, I haven't been on a vulnerability scanning team, so I don't know what level of validation they do to actually see, hey, yeah, the tool is reporting it, but does the vulnerability actually exist? But we'll get into a little bit later. Well, I guess it's right now. False positives. Any good penetration tester or vulnerability analyst should have the ability to detect false positives in scan results, because no tool is going to be perfect. Okay? As an example, the scanner reports that the system is vulnerable to http.sys vulnerability. It's a vulnerability in Microsoft web servers. But the problem is, the host is a Linux server. So what do? This is because the scanner is looking for a specific response. You need to do your research. You need to understand, what is the scanner looking for? What traffic is it sending? What is it trying to do? And how do you detect if it's a true positive or a false positive? It's because the scanner is looking for a specific response to its probes. And the Linux servers also send that same response, even though they don't have that actual file, the http.sys file, which is actually vulnerable. You don't know that until you start looking into it. I mean, I remember when I found this out, I was just like, this is just crazy, because all I knew was that the tool was telling me that, several tools were telling me that the system was vulnerable. However, when I looked at the system details, it says it's a Linux server, and I'm like, I don't think this is right. Another example, the scanner reports that the system is vulnerable to Oracle TNS listener vulnerability. The problem, the version of Oracle that they're running is patched. The alerts for an alternate port that's not the normal one that the vulnerability is found on. And the admins confirm that the system is running Oracle software, but it's not TNS. Again, same thing. You have to verify the data by seeing what the actual system is sending, or what the scanner is looking for, and then seeing how the system responds. Oftentimes, at least in my experience, that's the best way to verify true positives versus false positives outside of exploiting a vulnerability. Although, risks of vulnerability scanning. This is something that came up recently in some of our discussions. We were talking offline. There is a possibility that when you're doing vulnerability scanning, you could take systems offline, or cause them to crash or have other issues, There are several things to think about when you're talking about the risks of vulnerability scanning. You need to look at whether you're scanning production versus non-production environments. As a tester myself, I primarily test in non-production environments. However, sometimes we do production testing. So when I'm doing a test, especially a production test, I'm going to tune my tool to make sure that it does not cause any issues, such as knocking over the box. You want to make sure, you want to know your scanner and understand how much traffic it generates. Is there other network devices within the, between you and the target that could possibly be affected? Is the host going to have any issues with this? Because if you have, some older devices, you may need to check with your business unit and say, hey, have you guys experienced any other issues during testing with these scanners? And they may say, hey, well, every time this box gets scanned, it goes offline. So we need to find an alternative method to test the system. But again, in my experience, tuning your tools is very helpful. And again, it doesn't matter if it's something like Nessus or OpenBox or even something like Burp. Burp has its scanner capabilities. It can send a lot of traffic to that web server, and it can easily knock it over. Or Need2 or some of these other tools can do the same thing. Know how to tune your tool. Anybody have any questions?